pointer. So if you look, the lowest level, those are full professors, and you can see that the share of women full professors, this is doctoral programs in economics, so this is all 125 doctoral programs in economics, and you can see it has gone up from 5% to, looks like about 15% now. So there has been, over the course of this period, there has been 25 years, has been some growth there. Again, associate professors, there's been growth. Assistant professors, there was some growth, and you can see it has completely flatlined, and if anything, it has declined. Here, the next line is people getting getting their PhDs, then we have graduate students, and then we have undergraduates. You can see we now have more women who are undergraduates than are going into the these are senior majors, I guess, and they're actually, the women decline, so these are all right about the same, but you can see all of them have leveled off. For undergraduates and graduate students and assistant professors have all leveled off well below parity for women. If you look at the situation for departments without doctoral programs, our time series doesn't go back quite so far, but the situation is exactly the same. Again, there's been some increase in full professors, there's been some increase in associate professors as women work their way through the pipeline. There has been no increase in either assistant professors or majors in those other departments. Just so you know, these two surveys do cover essentially all of the economics undergraduates in the country. If you look at what's happened to women in the first year class, if we compare both the top 20 programs, and they're actually top, because we don't want to offend anybody, we have 21 schools in the top 20. And then we have all PhD programs. And you can see in the late 90s, the average was 26%. It's now up to 30%. For all PhD programs, again, it was 30% in the 90s, and now it's up to 34%. So you can see there's a little bit of progress sort of in the 90s up to 2000, but in the 2000s, it has literally been flat. There is no continuing progress in this century. If you look at the share of women in the first year PhD classes in the top 20 programs, we've broken this down to sort of look at the distribution within the top 20. And you can see a couple things that I think are really important. One is that there, as there was the case last year, I thought maybe after I announced this last year, because this would shame departments, but last year there were 6 departments in the top 20 that had fewer than 1/5 of their first year class was female. That is also true this year. They're not the same departments. So it's not that there are a couple departments that have a monopoly on having no women. There are many departments that seem to think that it's okay to have a first-year class that has fewer than 20% female. There are some departments, and this year there are 7 departments that again have more than 40% female. And I think there's some really interesting research on what the experience of women who are in departments like that is. Again, but that means there's like nobody in the 30% range. So half of the departments are really down here with less than a third women in their first year class. In order to help economics departments address the situation, we are now sending them back reports on their own graduate students and faculty based on what they've been telling CSWEP over the last 25 years. And so those benchmarking reports give you each department its own individual results relative to peer departments. So the top 10 schools are compared to top 10 to top 20 to top 20, and the other PhD departments to other PhD departments. We give them graduate students, faculty by rank, and then all of their department responses to the survey over time. And we're hoping that these reports and other kinds of resources that CSWEP and other parts of the AEA are producing, as well as other disciplines are producing, will help the economics profession address this issue so that we actually make progress and reverse this trend. This survey, by the way, while the results of the survey are not a model for the social sciences, we'd like something different. The survey itself is actually a model. There are no other disciplines that have this kind of longitudinal data on departments, so we have been. The profession has been making a commitment to this for a long time, and these data are now available for research purposes, both the department level data and the aggregate data. And actually, there are a couple papers that are coming out soon that are using it, so that's nice. I also just want to thank the University of Michigan staff who helped prepare the report and do most of the nagging of people. So thanks to Ann Rogers, Dawn Zinzer, and Anissa Bugela for that. Yeah, and I think now we turn over to the fun part of the celebration. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So thanks, Maggie. And I should say that Maggie has been stewarding this operation and been in charge of not just the survey, but the transition of the survey to usable data that other people can access. And I think that's a very important service to the profession. And Maggie, thank you so much for your leadership in doing that. Okay, well, it's my pleasure to preside now over the presentations of the awards. We are going to be presenting 2 awards today. The first is the Carolyn Shaw Bell Award, and the second is the Elaine Bennett Research Prize. And in both cases, I will not actually introduce the, we have others to do that. Let me just say a couple of words about the Carolyn Shaw Bell Award. And I note that I see several former Carolyn Shaw Bell Award winners here in the audience, so thank you. So Carolyn Shaw Bell was the founding chair of CSWEP. She was also an economics professor at Wellesley College, and a leader in the field and a leader in mentoring and encouraging women at both the undergraduate, graduate, and faculty levels. The CSWEP established a prize in her honor, and we have been awarding this prize every year, I believe, since 1998. This year, the recipient of the prize is Rohini Pandey, and Natalia Regal is going to present.
So first, I want to say I am so honored to be introducing Rohini. I have been lucky enough to benefit from Rohini's mentorship at every stage of my academic career. I have known Rohini first as her undergraduate research assistant, then her predoctoral fellow, graduate advisee, and now as her co-author, her colleague, and her friend. Other than my parents, there's nobody who deserves more credit and more thanks for where I am today than Rohini Pandey. Without her, I would have left this profession many years ago. As a poor, queer Latina immigrant, I already felt out of place as a Harvard undergraduate, but especially so in the economics department. I think sensing my passion for the work, but also my vulnerability, Rohini decided to take me under her wing. Over the last 12 years since then, her generosity, her active encouragement, and the example that she herself sets have pushed me forward, showing me that I do belong, that people like me can make positive contributions both to the profession and to policy. It's really hard for me to describe just how much Rohini cares. Maybe this best comes through in the way that with some kind of magical foresight, Rohini always seems to know where I might get tripped up and preemptively reaches out. For example, when I was a graduate student, as many of us are, I was deeply uncomfortable talking to professors. Sensing this, Rohini often invited me over to dinner parties with her colleagues so that I could meet and talk to people about my work in a friendly environment. Unfortunately for Rohini, this foresight also extends to issues in my personal life. I still remember how, When I got bit by a dog in India, Rohini privately contacted our research team and my best friend to force me to go get the rabies vaccines in the hospital because Rohini knows that I'm not very good at taking care of my health. Or how, when I broke my leg when I was her research fellow, Rohini would come to visit me at the hospital with food and novels to entertain myself. Rohini's care is also obvious in the way that she has, on so many occasions, directly intervened on my behalf. Just before my 4th year of graduate school, the partner organization of my job market project suddenly decided to pull out. I was devastated. When I told Rohini, she immediately responded and said that she was going to use her personal research funds to buy out my semester so I could be in India and find a way to make the project work. It wasn't a question. She just told me that she was doing this because this is just how Rohini is. Rohini also pushes me to stand up for myself. I remember clearly how in my 2nd year of graduate school, Rohini took me to meet with the Chief Minister of Rural Development in all of India. She does this all the time with her students and research assistants so that we can get practice pitching projects to senior officials. Like so many women, I am often reluctant to take ownership of my own work. So in the meeting, when describing a project for which Rohini and I are co-principal investigators, I called the work Rohini's study. Afterwards, she gave me one of her looks. She told me, "Never again will you credit our joint work to me." I can spend literally hours telling you anecdotes like this. So naturally, I used to flatter myself thinking that Rohini must really like me, because obviously she doesn't have time to devote so much effort to all of her students. But over the years, and especially in reading the over 20 beautiful letters in support of Rohini's nomination for this award, I see how wrong I was. RAs, employees, students, junior and senior faculty write about Rohini's incredible generosity and how her seemingly constant awareness of challenges that they might face have helped them succeed. One of Rohini's letter writers, now a tenured faculty member, wrote, "As a junior, it would have been easy for me to get lost, to not know people or to be known, to not get credit for my ideas or my work. But Rohini never let me be complacent or afraid." This letter writer goes on to describe how it was Rohini who sent her conference invites, nudging her to apply. And it was Rohini who showed up and gave her the encouragement to keep fighting after, at a crucial stage in this woman's career, she had been torpedoed with a vitriolic review. On top of her mentorship, and of course, aside from her very prolific research, Rohini finds the time to be a leader and a devoted campaigner for women in economics more broadly. She fights the big battles, the ones that directly involve institutional change. One of her colleagues at the Kennedy School writes, "Rohini is always the guaranteed voice in the room who will raise questions of gender whenever there's a potential for bias, whether it is how we select and advise graduate students, run junior and senior searches, mentor junior colleagues, vote on promotion or on tenure decisions. Rohini is there to ensure that the concerns of women academics have and the barriers that they face are given serious attention." But for Rohini, fighting these bigger battles is just not enough. She also dedicates herself to fighting the everyday small battles, the ones that take up time and seem insignificant enough that we often tell ourselves that it's okay to avoid the uncomfortable conversation and instead look the other way. For instance, last fall, Rohini took the time to go through each field's seminar schedule at Harvard. She took note of each field that had not a single invited female seminar speaker for the semester and personally reached out to the field heads as well as to the department. And it worked. Similarly, she has successfully pushed for more female chairs of conferences and female journal editors. As one of her letter writer notes, in typical Rohini behavior, Rohini has even threatened to boycott conferences if the representation of women in them did not increase. Through her example, Rohini makes us all more brave. In their letters for her nomination, almost every writer described some way in which, because of knowing Rohini, they had stood up. Here are just a few examples. A current second-year PhD student wrote that Rohini's drive inspired her to voice her discomfort with the imposing stairwell of all white male former department heads that greet you when you enter the Harvard Economics Department. It turns out she wasn't the only one feeling that way. This student's initiative led to a petition and now to a redecoration of that stairwell. Another student tells of how she challenged a professor when, in a lecture about discrimination, he kept referring to papers in which a woman was the first author instead by the names of her male co-authors. A tenured faculty member wrote, "Because of Rahini, I was moved to speak up when the marital status of a potential female hire was brought up as a negative collocation issue. I hadn't managed in the past to speak up with the force of my conviction that we should not consider spousal reasons more of a handicap for a female than a male candidate." Rahini has dedicated her life, in her research and otherwise, to the cause of women. I hope that we can all follow her example and keep fighting the big and the small battles. So I think you have to pick that up.
Oh,
I was supposed to have presented it to you, but.
I think I was supposed to do that.
Oh.
I was going to do that at the end. No, but okay, here we go. I'm giving it back to you now. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I didn't make that part very clear. Okay, here we go. Natalia, you can also get a picture.
Plenty of pictures together.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's a true honor to receive this award. Thank you, Natalia. And thanks to everyone who wrote letters. I'm also incredibly honored to be following in the footsteps of so many amazing women who won this award before me. For my own career progression, I have many to thank: my family, those who mentored me, co-authored with me, and the many students I've learned from. Thank you. I think many of you know who you are. I'm grateful for the professional support I have received. But at the same time, I'm also acutely aware that as a profession, we're currently failing many young women. Just 10 days ago, over 300 graduate students and research fellows across US economics departments put out an open letter to our profession requesting institutional changes that, I quote, address the power imbalances that drive out talented individuals, prevent the inclusion of underrepresented groups, and collectively damage our discipline, unquote. Young women are falling off or are being pushed off the ladder in our profession. As we just saw, the share of women in the US in economics has stagnated for several decades. And recent work suggests that the share of junior assistant professors is actually declining. Lundberg and Stern's report that the share of female assistant professors fell from 29 to 24% between 2009 and 2017. While levels of female faculty representation in economics are comparable to those in the hard sciences, the trend in economics remains among the worst. We should care about this, not only out of a sense of justice, but out of concern for our profession. When women fall off the ladder, we lose some of our most talented economists. A lack of diversity limits the range of questions we ask and the kind of answers we are able to give, which impoverishes not only us as a discipline, but also those in governments, companies, and NGOs who count on our insights. So a recurring theme in my talk today is going to say that in a world with bias, simply acting on what we believe are our convictions may not be enough. And so to drive this home, let me start with my own personal experience. I grew up in India, and like with many born into privilege, it took me a long time to realize what privilege meant. As I began my second year in undergraduate economics, the Indian government sought to introduce quotas for lower castes. Student protests broke out across our campuses, and I remember how I and my colleagues engaged in many earnest discussions about how economics had taught us that it was about merit and ability, and people don't need an extra help. We largely ignored that pretty much without exception, all of us engaged in these conversations belonged to these elite castes. In 1992, job quotas were implemented, and I left India for Oxford. And suddenly I went from being a member of the Indian elite to being an outsider in a system where privilege worked in a slightly different way. And I think seeing this jarred my thinking. Now I was in a place where you could tell a person's social stature, not by their name, but by the way they talked. And I began to realize that what we often adopt or what we think of as fair systems are often not those. They often end up putting some sets of people, typically those who are excluded by a prevalent norm regarding who deserves, at disadvantage. I learned that in a theoretically race-blind, caste-blind, or gender-blind system that thinks it's rewarding merit, you may not do so when the playing field is uneven to start with. And that historical discrimination and inequality can imbalance present power structures such that for some groups, all playing fields are always uneven. Over the years, through my research and by being in this profession, I also learned the power of norms. I think socialization of norms means that for all of us, it can become second nature that men and women who behave similarly are judged differently. A man is ambitious, while many of us have often been described as women with sharp elbows. A man's research reflects his brilliance, while a woman's research reflects her hard work. Assertiveness, drive, competitiveness, these are considered as masculine traits, just as modesty, cooperation, and caregiving are female traits. And so in our profession, women often end up facing the catch-22 of being subject to harsh commentary on their abilities when they show exactly the same traits that are used to identify the potential for success. I've been lucky to have colleagues who have called me out when I've been blinded by biased norms. I've also been lucky to have many friends who have led by example. And as you've seen, I've learned from an amazing set of students. But I, like others, have also on occasion been careless. I've not always noticed the quiet, thoughtful woman in my classroom, and I've often jumped in far too fast with a question in the seminar. I've been guilty of lazily assuming that a 6'3" tall male PhD student would be a thick-skinned and confident researcher when exactly the opposite was true. And unfortunately, these careless judgments can add up in terms of who feels supported and confident to pursue the research they love. And as the open letter from our graduate students reminds us, systemic change requires institutions that will move us closer to an equal playing field. The power of norms is such that it can make certain behaviors second nature. And so I think what lies ahead for us is to try to identify how we can shape our norms and institutions to limit this kind of careless injustice that happens far too often. How do we do this? I don't have a lot of answers, but here are some things that I think I have learned and I think we have learned as a profession. First, let me start with what I think we value and why in our profession. Abstract thinking and hierarchical categorization permeates our profession. Alongside, we hold dear the idea that our profession is a meritocracy, a free market for talent. Yet we often find talent by placing some researchers in a star category based on simple but poorly justified concepts of quality of mind. In doing so, we often fail to recognize bias and how it perpetuates. We run the danger of making invisible on all those work that a star's work depends. We reward the individual for teamwork such that our professional rankings end up reflecting an inaccurate model of how actually our profession works. We have, in the end, I think right now, devalued collaboration among both graduate students and junior faculty. The cost of such simplistic categorization can be high. We lose talented individuals who believe that the models don't speak to the issues of social justice they care about. We lose brilliant collaborative researchers who are not identified as stars. And we lose researchers who bring a new valid voice in the profession. And as a result, we often fail to provide the more nuanced policy advice that can support a democracy where not all values are shared and where growth isn't the tide that raises all boats. Implicit bias and oversimplified categorization doesn't just exist in individual judgments. They're also built into our institutional systems. For the case of women, I believe institutional change requires us to understand a fact we just saw: why is economics a leaky pipeline? Let me talk a little bit about what I think we've learned about 4 points. The first stage is undergraduate economics. I think we heard a lot about the statistics on this. One thing I wanted to highlight is that there has been a lot of recent initiatives. So for instance, department-specific experiments, part of the initiative led by Claudia Golden, has led a lot of promising results which are going to be easy to implement. We should all be pushing our departments to be informing high-performing students about the relative performance and exposing students to successful female graduates. These are easy things to do. Relatively, we need to acknowledge diversity of perspectives, values, and norms early on. Several departments are reformulating their introductory economics courses to make explicit the moral values. We could do much more to be advertising these efforts. More broadly, it's important that we recognize that in the end, individuals can't do everything to correct biases for what female graduates face during their BA. We need to institutionalize ways to ensure that departments encourage female undergraduates. My colleague Dan Levy, for instance, has developed a software that tracks students' comments in classes, alerts instructors of uneven participation, and prompts them to include students more equally. I've certainly benefited from using this in my classroom. But more critically, I see Golden's undergraduate innovations as telling us all that we can and should be experimenting and learning from pilot projects. Just after Christmas, and I thank my many friends who responded, I polled some of my colleagues for ideas. And what I was struck by was how much is being done as individual initiatives and how little I knew about them. I would urge AEA and CSWEP to think of ways of just making sure that people know what other people are trying. So the second stage is entry into graduate school. Again, as we heard, the percent of female students undergraduate and graduate economics programs has remained roughly constant at 30%. And this has led some to suggest that the problem on average isn't at the transition from undergraduate to graduate, but is actually at the stage after that into the first job. But I think there are two facts that suggest otherwise. First, as we saw, there's huge variation in the proportion of female students. Second, a very large fraction of our graduate students are not students who've completed the undergraduate in the US. Here are some statistics. So Bustan and Lange report that between 1994 and 2017, 47% of PhDs in economics in US schools were non-US citizens. I looked at 6 top economics departments for the job market candidates this year. 52% had non-US undergraduate degrees. Within this pool of job market candidates, the gender imbalance is significantly worse in the non-US undergraduate pool. So 36% of job market candidates in the non-US undergraduate group were women compared to 52% in the US undergraduate group. And so in fact, there are 2 pipelines that are feeding into the graduate school admit pool. We just don't know how they interact, and so we know little about whether there is a problem and where. That said, I think we can again start learning from individual department experiences. At Stanford, female admission rates were relatively low a few years ago. Muriel Niederli, Pascaline Dupa, and other faculty identified narrowness of screening criteria, and they sought to instead implement broader criteria, which in the short run has meant that they spend a lot of time reading individual files. At this point, however, it has yielded returns for Stanford in a pretty person-intensive way. They've seen a significant rise in female admission rates. A second concern that I think is echoed in the job market as well is herding across departments. A small set of women get many offers. This outcome is consistent with the use of narrow criteria that screen on characteristics that are more common in the male applicant than the female applicant pool. So what can we do? I think we should start thinking about blinding some parts of the process. We have a lot of evidence that blinding has results in other places. Things like personal evaluation statements, others could be blinded when they're being reviewed by graduate admission committees. I think as job advertisers, letter writers, and reviewers, we should institutionalize ways of knowing how gendered the use of language is. We all complain about it at job market season time. Individuals can do it now on their websites, but I think departments could just pass all letters through such mechanisms. Departments and centralized processes such as Interfolio could easily use such websites to gender check. At my department in HKS, now all job advertisements before they go on to any public forum are gender checked. Third, given that exposure to female economists influences young women's interest in choosing economics, I think there are high returns to increasing the representation of women in international fora such as International Econometric Society meetings. We can do much better here than if you go to the current econometrics website and see what the numbers are. I think departments should track much more admission decisions and learn what criteria are good predictors. Because absent some better understanding of the model that predicts success, we're going to continue admitting too few women. So the third stage is female economists on average have a worse placement record for their first job. Here, a common concern that I heard when I polled female economists is aggressive behavior in seminars, that this shuts women down, and that this can be particularly paralyzing in high-stake settings such as job talks. We also, by now, have robust evidence of professional bias in how refereeing works and in how much credit women get for co-authored work. So what can be done here? I think we can have simple norm setting in seminars. A number of departments have started doing it. This can be done much more broadly. We should investigate the returns to job screening processes that are less reliant on individual perceptions of quality and routinize the process. Small biases in how department faculty judge student work can get amplified if the placement process uses this judgment to decide discrete differences in which students get recommended to which departments. We could experiment with basing department interview lists on reviews of job markets that do not rely on placement officers telling us whom to look at. We could also ensure that identical questions in the same order are asked of all candidates, and one faculty member keeps track at the rates at which male and female candidates are interrupted during interviews. Decades of research in decision science tells us that structured interviews do a much better job predicting future performance than unstructured conversations. We can use written forms for faculty reviews of candidates with multiple criteria. What we definitely need to do is to move away from gestalt evaluations such as, I like him better than his job market paper, or strong on unobservables, or conversely, her paper is not economics. I think we've all heard these claims far too often. And finally, improving hiring practices to include women is not the same as interviewing the 3 female candidates that all top schools are interviewing. Departments should set similar candidates. Far too often, we focus on ungettable women and gettable men. Departments should track the outside offers received by women and men who they interview, fly out, and give offers to. The last stage is relative to men. Women publish less in the first 7 years of their career. And here it's clear that departments can and should do more to reduce the career costs of having children. We now have evidence that equalizing maternity and paternity leave in economics departments disadvantages women. But I'm not sure if we're acting on this evidence. And perhaps departments can also consider making allowances for pre-birth pregnancy costs, which I think many women report as being quite costly for them. We can aim to have greater diversity in our department speakers, which is, I think many of us forget almost the fortune we have when we are in charge of a seminar and can choose whom to invite. It's a wholly discretionary activity. Routinization of feedback procedures, whether by mentors or committees, should be undertaken. I think having a mentor isn't enough. I know firsthand that as a mentor, I've made mistakes. And as a mentee early on, I received advice that I know was incorrect. One important lesson that I learned is that for those of us who act as mentors, advisors, or supervisors, it's important to recognize that brilliance in research isn't necessarily correlated with thickness of skin. Negative experiences that some individuals can put behind them or even find positive in overcoming can prove devastating for others. Some individuals thrive on adversity while others just don't. A research career does not need to be a trial by fire. In a profession where women are a minority, female economists are both more likely to be at the receiving end of romantic interest, desired or undesired, from often senior male economists and to partner with them. The power dynamics that can ensue when women reject advances or when relationships end can play out in the profession for years in ways that neither party might expect. These experiences can certainly cause some to leave the profession. This is a problem that by its very nature hides its true extent. Hopefully, instituting profession-wide reporting mechanisms such as Callisto that I believe the AEA is considering will help us learn and, more importantly, reduce sexual harassment. As my colleague Iris Bonet puts it, it is easier to debias institutions than it is to debias individuals. And that's really what I've been advocating for in this talk. But we need to acknowledge that the changing the direction of institutions is heavy and exhausting work. And the work of changing institutions to benefit women can often end up being a very substantial lady tax. So how are we going to solve this? I think the first thing is small changes are better than no changes at all and can often engender more changes. Something as simple as emailing your colleague who's organizing one of the department's seminars but has too few female speakers does make a difference. Second, we need to acknowledge the value of outside help and the potential value of using external consultants rather than relying on the women in our departments to effect change. And third, to just continue this theme, this cannot be the work of women. We need to make the case to the majority of men who believe either that their own decisions are meritocratic or that institutions to correct discrimination is the work of others. We need to show them that institutional bias can mean that the information that they base their decisions on is in itself warped. In the end, we are in this field because we believe that economics research done well can change the world for better. And along those lines, let me conclude by acknowledging 3 pieces of work that changed how I think. Lundberg and Stark's paper on private discrimination and social interventions, showing that laws preventing discrimination could improve allocative efficiency, were an early influence on my own PhD work. Claudia Golden and Ceci Rouse's work on blinding orchestra trials demonstrated to me the power of debiasing institutions. And finally, Marianne Bertrand, Emir Kamenika, and Jessica Pan's work on gender identity and relative income highlighted for me the close link between gender dynamics and power struggles. I'm a better economist for these papers having been written, and I look forward for the day when our economics research more fully reflects a diverse range of voices and values. And this, in turn, helps shape our departmental and professional practices such that female economists need not have sharp elbows for economics to recognize their value. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rohini. The Carolyn Shaw Bell Award was established to recognize a woman who advances the status of women in the economics profession through example, achievement, mentoring, or leadership, And I think you can see that Rohini was actually not an or, but an and on all of those categories. The second award that we're here to discuss is the Elaine Bennett Research Prize. Elaine Bennett was a young woman economist who died very young, who was made important contributions in game theory and was also an early pioneer in experimental economics. The prize was established in 1998 to recognize the research of a woman economist who is fewer than 7 years post-PhD. Today, we're happy to recognize Melissa Dell, Carolyn Shaw Bell, Melissa Dell, sorry about that, and Nathan Nunn is going to introduce.
Thank you. So it's my real honor to introduce and tell you a few words about Melissa Dell, who's an amazing colleague of mine and an amazing scholar. And as the award indicates, very young in her career, or very early in her career. Melissa graduated from MIT in 2012. She started right out of the gate by joining the Society of Fellows for 2 years until 2014, and then became an assistant professor at Harvard in 2014, and very recently in 2018 became a tenured full professor. In terms of her research, she'll talk a little bit about her research, I believe. I just want to give you some sense of what I think is most central to her research, which is a little bit hard to characterize, like many individuals with amazing broad research agendas. It spans a vast amount of literature and of area. But I think what's really central to her research is the importance of state institutions for economic development. And so because she's looking at this question, which is a big picture, really important question that we really haven't been able to grapple with in development economics or economic growth, her research has tended to be historical in nature. So states evolve over long periods of time, and they have effects which persist over very long periods of time. And also what seems to be central, or tends to be central in her research, is conflict, coercion, warfare seems to also be central. And again, this is because states tend to have a monopoly on violence, and so this is something that's central to them. And also conflict, coercion is something that also has the potential to cause trouble for states or delegitimize states. So her research has tackled, like I said, these big picture issues, and she's made huge progress. I think orders of magnitude progress relative to what had been done before her research. So you might wonder, well, how is it that she was able to do this? Certainly other people have thought about these issues. These are huge issues. But they're very difficult to answer. And so I think the answer here is, well, two things which characterize her research. One is the creation of new data, right? And so lots of these questions, we really just didn't have the data on historical states, for example, outcome variables of things that states affected or affected states. And this was really through a huge amount of archival research. So this is going to locations, I'll talk a bit more about this, and digging up data which are in paper form or book form, manuscript form, and digitizing these. Okay? And so the other thing is leveraging an extremely deep knowledge. So that's another characteristic of Melissa, which I'll talk a bit more about, to come up with what I think are really ingenious identification strategies. So really understanding through the secondary literature the history, the context of a setting, and using that, or reading that with an eye of thinking about, okay, how can I get causal estimates that are credible and well identified? And so I think if I'm just to talk about her research, these are just kind of things, without going into a lot of detail, that kind of really stand out for me. So I want to talk a bit more about Melissa as a researcher. This is something that you might not get from reading her papers, or isn't obvious from reading her papers. And I think as a researcher, she is, equally as amazing or even more amazing than her amazing papers. So I first met Melissa in 2007. I believe she can correct me if I'm wrong, she was in her first year, maybe second year of her PhD program, but I think a first year. I was a assistant professor, just arrived at Harvard, and she asked if I wanted to join a discussion group that she had organized. So that's already impressive that someone in their first year is organizing a discussion group. It had postdocs, so Suresh Naidu was in it, other students like Noam Yuckman, myself, and these were all of us were interested in long-run historical development. And so we met regularly, probably once a week, twice a week, had lunch, talked about these issues. And I distinctively remember one conversation where we were all talking about how our research is going, and she was lamenting the fact that, well, you know, my research, I'm finished all my papers now. This is first year, remember, of PhD. I've finished all my papers now, and now I have to think of new ideas, and so I'm in this weird stage. And so it turns out one of her papers was a paper which just 2 years later was published in Econometrica. And so this is a paper that she had started at Oxford in her master's program on the Spanish forced labor system, the MITA. So, you know, this has kind of left an impression on me. And I often tell this story to my PhD class and say, you know, this is, I don't know if it discourages them or inspires them that this is the track Melissa was on, and you should, you know, I guess by second year of your PhD, it's maybe too late to be on that track. So anyway, so this is all just to say I was amazingly impressed by Melissa when I first met her. And it's, you know, so much so that these kind of events stick out clearly in my mind. And I'm not the only one. I've had conversations with others in the room, so Joel, James Robinson, Jerome, where they can distinctively remember the first time that they met Melissa. And so this is something that's very, you know, as an undergrad usually, or a master's student or early PhD student. So that's one thing is about Melissa is just extremely impressive from very early on in her career. So as a researcher, I guess technically I'm senior to her, older, have more gray hair. But I definitely look up to Melissa. There's a lot of things about her as a researcher that I emulate, that I would like to aspire to be equal to. And so there's just a few things I just want to list of things about her that I really, really admire. So she's a true scholar. So I think in her research, she really has a desire to understand the world, right? So not to necessarily just publish papers in top journals, but to really, really understand the world and these particular topics that she is interested in. So I think one example of this is how she came up with the paper that she wrote as a master's student that was published in Econometrica. So this is about the Peruvian forced labor system. And the story behind it, she can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is basically it, is she was backpacking around Peru, around this area. And I guess as we all do when we're backpacking as a young person, had informal focus groups with people in villages and asked them about comparative development and said, you know, why is that village over there so much more poor than this village or vice versa? And the explanation that they had is, well, you know, there was this forced labor system under the Spanish crown hundreds of years ago, and that might be part of the reason. So I think that's just one great example where you just literally want to understand the world around you, even if you're on vacation and, you know, and should be having a good time. So, and then the other one is her early career. She was focusing on Latin America, had been very successful, or it was very successful. From talking to her, I think what she really wants to understand is development generally. And there's a big difference in the pattern of development in Latin America and in Asia. So now she has moved to Asia because she wants to have a complete understanding of states, the process of development around the world, and has moved to Asia. Although, you know, even though most people who are senior who would give you advice would say, well, that's not efficient. You've already done all of this fixed costs in Latin America. You're the expert in the world, Latin American history, economic history of Latin America. I would suggest not to do that, right? And so that's another, I think, indicator that she really is just a true scholar. The second characteristic is that she's an extremely tenacious, persistent researcher. And so to give you an example of this, this comes from her paper in the QJ, Nation Building Through Foreign Intervention. And so for those of you that have seen the paper, it's basically what happens when the U.S. bombs the heck out of different parts of Vietnam. And there's a brilliant RD strategy where the US created these scores, which is A, B, C, D, which is indicate how much we'll bomb these different hamlets. But there was an underlying running variable, a continuous score, and so you can do a kind of an RD in that dimension. And the problem was that she had the scores, but she didn't have the underlying running variable. She knew that they existed, so she first scoured the National Archives and Records Administration, which was in College Park, Maryland. So that's the first thing that's impressive, that she would go to the archives and spend much time there. And they were nowhere to be found, right? So you can't really do this RD if you don't have this running variable. So then she scoured the secondary literature. So what journal articles are there that write about these documents? And she found an article in the very well-known journal, The History Teacher, which we all read regularly. And so in it, an archivist mentioned the poor archiving techniques that had been done, and so that not all of the documents from this wartime era had actually made their way to this NARA. So then she called up Fort McNair, which is this military research university, went to DC, and then basically rummaged around in boxes in the basement of this building, and then eventually found these printouts of the underlying data that she needed. Okay, so that's impressive, and I distinctly remember being at an NBER working group for the DAE, Development of the American Economy, and she was just kind of explaining how she got these documents. And this is the story that she told. In the middle, this is the first time I've ever seen this. In the middle of the talk, people broke out in applause, just because of the perseverance and persistence of Melissa in her endeavors in that case. I think that's just kind of one example. I think that's more indicative of her research in general and the attitude that she takes in general, and in terms of her persistence and tenacity. And so I think this might be a trait about her in general, not just research. So, she can tell you more about her ultra marathon running, which is, again, shows her persistence and her tenacity. She runs more in one race than I do in my lifetime. So, okay, and the other two things is, well, she digs very deep in her research. Like I mentioned, she's an expert in all that she studies. I've witnessed or talked to a number of historians, so these are people outside of economics, who have mentioned that they're extremely impressed by her historical knowledge. They're also very jealous by it, and they're also jealous by her talents in terms of archives and coming up with interesting data and interesting questions. And then just the very last thing I want to mention is that in addition to this research, she's an amazing contributor to public goods in the department and also the profession. Okay, and so I just to give you an example, this is very recent. Melissa recently received tenure and was bargaining for, what all the goodies that she'll get in her contract. And while most of us would think about, okay, how much research money can I get? How much summer money? Maybe we can form an institution, name it after me, or I'll be the director. Melissa, actually, her demands were very different. Really what she wanted was some funds and some support to use OCR and machine learning techniques to begin to digitize all of the historical documents in Widener Library. Okay, and so this is something that's going to benefit the profession, definitely going to, and benefit all that are doing research along those lines. And you can see it's very much a public goods. And she was really looking out for what will advance our knowledge, what will advance the knowledge of the profession, rather than what are all the goodies that I can get. So for all these reasons, I can't think of a better recipient, and I'm very happy that Melissa Dell was chosen this year for the Elaine Bennett Research Prize. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathan. It's certainly an honor for me to hear those things from somebody who I admire so much. And thank you also to my advisors, my family, other colleagues who have been wonderful mentors and really helped me to develop as a researcher. So I want to spend a few minutes giving everyone a little bit more of a flavor for the sort of research that I do and the things that I'm most excited about moving forward. Okay, so my research focuses on persistence and transformation and economic development, so why poverty and insecurity persist, and also how states influence economic development and security in the long run. And I try to emphasize integrating modern empirical methods with novel historical data. So I really take inspiration from Bob Solow, who I think summed it up well when he said the part of economics that is independent of history and social context is not only small, but dull. So I want to just give a short example that gives a flavor for the type of research I do. So Nathan mentioned this briefly, and I'll elaborate a little bit more. So military interventions in weakly institutionalized societies were a central feature of the Cold War, and of course they continue through the present and have massive impacts on people's lives, consume a lot of resources, but we don't have that much empirical evidence on their impacts. So in joint work with Pablo Carabin, who's at NYU, we examine how U.S. strategies employed during the Vietnam War impacted insurgency and impacted state building in South Vietnam. And in particular, we focus on the impacts of bombing. And so U.S. dropped a lot of bombs over South Vietnam, and they weren't just targeted specifically towards insurgents, but also towards civilian areas more generally as a way of trying to encourage compliance from the South Vietnamese population. So you see an example here of a leaflet that was dropped warning people in South Vietnam of bombing. It says the U.S. forces have joined with the forces of South Vietnam to rid your village of Viet Cong agents and protect your lives. The Viet Cong hide among the innocent women and children in your villages to fire upon troops and aircraft. If the Viet Cong in this area use you or your village for this purpose, you can expect death from the sky. Do not let the Viet Cong be the reason for the death of your loved ones. So there's two views, broadly speaking, on this. So the first, which was the consensus view of the U.S. during the war and still remains very prevalent to this day, the solution in Vietnam is more bombs, more shells, more napalm, till the other side gives up. So essentially that you can use overwhelming firepower to incentivize compliance and build a state from the top down. The opposing view is summed up by one of the communist leaders in Vietnam who said, never before did the people of Vietnam from top to bottom unite as they did during the years that the U.S. was bombing us. Never before had Chairman Ho Chi Minh's appeal that there is nothing more precious than freedom and independence gone straight to the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. So according to this view, this is going to backfire on the U.S. You bomb civilians, they get angry, that makes them that much more likely to go and join the resistance. You can't build a state via overwhelming force because people have so many different small ways to undermine a state that they don't support. So to examine these views, we need to find a natural experiment. Obviously, if you were just to look at the correlation between bombing and what happened subsequently, that's not going to give you a very good picture of the causal effects of bombing, because if the U.S. military is at all aware of kind of what's going on, they may well want to bomb places where security is going downhill anyways. And so we needed to find an identification strategy. And so we exploited the fact that during the Vietnam War, for the very first time, data were collected and used on a large scale to allocate military resources. So you see an example here of the IBM System 360 supercomputer in Saigon, which at the time was the world's most powerful computer. So specifically, the U.S. collected these 169 different questions at the hamlet level. A hamlet is a cluster of dwellings. There were about 18,000 of them in South Vietnam. And these were data on security, but also politics, economic characteristics. And they combined these into a single score using the Bayesian algorithm. And the output ranged continuously from 1 to 5, but it was rounded to the nearest whole number before being read from the mainframe computer. So if you're a 3.49, you get rounded down to a 3. If you're a 3.51, you get rounded up to a 4. The 3 is a less secure place and hence more likely to be bombed. The score was used by the U.S. Air Force to allocate air missions. It wasn't used by South Vietnamese or U.S. ground or naval troops. It really, the focus of the score was on the Air Force. Over half of appropriations during the Vietnam War went to the Air Force, and so they just had so many bombs to drop that they needed something to tell them where to drop them, and they used the score. So we'll compare around the rounding thresholds to estimate the causal effects of bombing. And here you can just very much see our results graphically. And so on the x-axis, you have the distance from the rounding threshold, and on the y-axis, you have the probability that the village is bombed. And you can see if you just barely get rounded up, that shifts markedly downward. And then we compare that to various outcomes. So for example, this is whether or not there is an armed insurgent presence near your hamlet. And you can see if you get rounded up, so you're more secure and less likely to get bombed, then following the bombing, there's less likely to be an armed presence near your village. So more generally, we find that bombing civilian population centers actually increase the military and political activities of the Viet Cong insurgency. So it backfired immediately. Moreover, the fact that security declined meant that your score went down, meant that you were more likely to get bombed in the next period, and so on and so forth. So if you're just barely below a rounding threshold at the start of when the U.S. used this algorithm, you're more likely to get bombed for the remainder of the war, and security deteriorates more generally. Not only does the bombing affect security, it also weakened local governance and decreased participation in non-communist civil society. The effects are concentrated in the areas that are actually hit. It's not as if you see your neighbor being bombed and think, oh, I better shape up. The effects are in the places that are hit, and we can look at a variety of different pre-characteristics and show that really when you look around the threshold, places on either side look very, very similar before, and it's only after the bombing that we see this divergence. And so this very much gives an example of the type of research that I do. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking briefly about future directions that I am particularly excited about now. So there's many open questions in thinking about long-run development and political economy. Really, most things we still don't understand that well. And there's various reasons for this, but an important reason is because of the challenges that are inherent in accessing the data that would be required to compellingly look at many of these questions. So much of the literature to date, including my work, sort of has the flavor that you look at something that happened historically, you show that it still has effects today, and then you try to understand why. But it's, this thing happened and then it's persistent. There's less work that looks at richer dynamics in the development process. So, takeoff, convergence and reversal, the idea that you could have leapfrogging, where a place that's behind jumps ahead, or institutional sclerosis, where you have a place that's very successful and then they stagnate. There's less about these richer dynamics. The misallocation has been a huge topic in the development literature recently, but there's less about the role that plays in hindering long-run development. We know less about why structural change is sometimes accompanied by social upheaval or large increases in inequality, whereas in other contexts it proceeds much more smoothly or more equitably. And sort of a common thread uniting these questions is that in order to look at them, you really need very detailed data. In many cases, you'll need microdata on firms or individuals. You can't really think about the drivers of inequality or misallocation with aggregate data. If you want to document more complex patterns of persistence and change over time, if your standard errors are large because your data are aggregated or noisy, you're not going to be able to do that. You can say something had an effect in 1920, 30, 40, 50, but with big standard errors, all those effects will look statistically identical. And at first I thought that, well, maybe these richer data sources just don't exist and we have to content ourselves, with the stereotypical view of economic history that you have, 5 observations and that's what you have to work with. But actually, in reality, there are quite a few pretty rich sources of historical data, but digitization can be extremely costly. So for some really heavily studied contexts like the US, there has been a fair amount of digitization of historical sources, but much less for contexts that have not been as extensively studied. For those of you who don't do this type of research, just to give you a brief overview of sort of what the status quo of working with historical data is like. So once you've actually found the data and scanned it, the data might be scattered very irregularly, intermingled with text. First of all, you have to pull out the tables that you want, and then you need to send those to a data entry company who will type them manually, and they're going to make a lot of errors. Even if you use double entry, you need to identify those errors and correct them, and then you're left with all these table fragments, and you need to assemble them together in a data set that you can use and analyze. This is costly, and it actually becomes more and more costly as the size of the data set increases to digitize an additional unit of data, because the freelancers that these data entry companies hire get worse and worse as they have to hire more and more of them for your larger and larger data set. And so this is really a problem if you need like rich detailed data. So for about the past year, I've been working on automating the data curation pipeline, and this is something that you really can't do with sort of off-the-shelf tools. So you need to combine computer vision tools that can recognize table structures with machine learning techniques for classifying the output. So commercial OCR software, which you would think maybe should be able to do this, tends to do very poorly when table structures are irregular, as they often are in historical documents. If you want to recognize the OCR software to recognize your table structures, you have to manually draw boxes around it, which at that point you might as well just type it in yourself. And then you also need to assemble everything together. And so just to briefly sort of outline the pipeline that we've developed, so the first thing you have to do is remove irregularities that happen when you scan historical books, right? If you can't take the binding off the book, it won't lay perfectly flat, and that's going to introduce distortions in your scan. And there's other things like this. So you need to remove those. And then you need to use computer vision to recognize the table structures. Then we can use commercial OCR software to OCR individual rows of the document. And finally, you need to assemble the data fragments together using deep learning. So I want to just give you an example of what we've done with this. So it's not very interesting, I think, in the abstract, but it's pretty cool, like when it allows you to examine questions that otherwise just you wouldn't be able to do. So the motivation for developing this pipeline was a project on Japan's economic purge, which is joint with Sahar Parsa at Tufts and Jia Zhu, who's our pre-doctoral fellow, best student I've ever worked with, and is applying to PhD programs now. So just a small plug there. So during the occupation of Japan, the Allied forces implemented an economic purge of senior managers in large Japanese firms. So essentially the US blamed these large conglomerates for the militarization of Japan. They wanted Japan to go out and conquer the Pacific so they could have large markets for their inputs and their output. And so the US blamed these large firms. But they didn't want to have trials because that's very complicated, right? So in Germany, there were these denazification, actually trials of people. But, let's say that, I don't like Joel very much. I want to blame him for the militarization of Japan. And how is the U.S. going to know whether that's like accurate or not, right? So General MacArthur just wanted a rule. He said that any firm with a net worth of over 100 million yen, its managers between 1937 and 1945 would no longer be eligible to work at large firms, but they could go work at smaller firms. It so happens to be the case that these smaller firms tend to be in the newer sectors because the more traditional sectors are dominated by these large conglomerates. And so we want to look at what happens both to the firms whose managers are removed, but also to the firms that the managers move to, which are interestingly enough in these kind of newer, more innovative sectors. And this is we see this as part of maybe helping us to understand the larger puzzle of why Japan was able to be so successful in the years following World War II at innovating the miniaturization of electronics, and yet more recently, hasn't seemed to be as dynamic or flexible. So this is just showing you what the economic purge looks like. So again, it's kind of similar to the previous graph that I showed you for bombing. So it's distance from this threshold on the x-axis, and then the share of firms that have managers purged. So some managers could be purged below the threshold, but above this threshold, it's at 100% because that was mandatory. Now, a big part of the challenge here, if we just wanted to look around the threshold, that's straightforward enough, but we also want to look using a different identification strategy at what happens to the firms that the purge managers move to. And in order to be able to find where the purge managers went, we need to search comprehensive personnel records for the entire Japanese economy. And that is a lot of information, right? So just to give you a sense for what that looks like, this is one page. There's tens of thousands of pages that look like this page. For those of you who don't read Japanese, you have some financial variables here, but also, the names of managers. And so there's tens of thousands of pages that look like this. We also need outcome data. And so we have these records, which contain really, really rich firm-level outcome data over a long span of time. But again, tens of thousands of pages. I can't find even if I had an infinite budget, which I don't, I can't find qualified labor in Japan, which is a high-wage economy, to type all of this stuff in. It's just not going to happen. Then you have the purge records. These are the names of purge managers from the U.S. National Archives, and again, many, many pages that look like this. And so we apply the process that I told you about to automate the digitization of these records. So just to give a motivating example, this is Mandai Junshiro. He was the chair of Mitsui, which is one of Japan's largest conglomerates. He was purged. So we want to figure out where does Junshiro go to after he's purged. So we can find him here and then find him over in the personnel records. It turns out he goes to Sony. That is a firm that has 7 employees. It's in the basement of a Tokyo department store, and he brings all of his connections to finance and to exporters and other things to Sony and becomes the president of Sony, where he presides over its meteoric rise. So as Nathan mentioned, I'm working on a new initiative to apply these techniques more generally. So we've partnered with the Harvard Libraries and are scraping scans from the public domain. So the Harvard Libraries, like the books in the Google Books project, come from them, and they have all those scans. And so we want to digitize data on a much larger scale. Of course, automation is never going to be perfect. So part of what we're doing is depositing this in an open access repository, and there will be tools there to crowdsource corrections to data and to be able to visualize the data as well. And so the objective here is that it's just can be very costly to do historical research. It really favors researchers who have a lot of access to funding. It favors more senior researchers who can gain funds. We really want to democratize access to historical data, to ranging from writing an undergrad paper to a large-scale data initiative that would just be infeasible to do with manual digitization techniques. And I'll just briefly say that these sort of new tools in vision, machine learning, et cetera, are not limited to just digitizing tables. So of course, many of you are probably familiar with natural language processing. That's been used a lot to think about, extracting information from newspapers, but you can do the same thing with government records, propaganda, historical radio broadcasts, really vast amounts of unstructured data that we can try to understand better through natural language processing, computer vision to process historical satellites, video footage, aerial photography. So for example, in the U.S. National Archives, there's 6 million aerial photographs that were taken by the CIA. Like the U.S. during the Cold War was trying to see what was going on in much of the world, and kind of much as you can use modern satellite data to measure things like economic activity from the modern satellite data, you could potentially do something similar with these historical aerial photographs to get economic data for regions and time periods where we don't have it. Of course, there's a large literature on linking historical microdata. And so all of this is opening access to new data, and I think really excitingly also doing it for contexts of the world that have not traditionally been studied within the mainstream of economics. So I think it's like a really, really exciting time to be an economic historian, and I think that we'll be seeing, lots of learning lots of new fascinating things using these tools. So just to sum up, I've argued that understanding history is important for understanding processes of economic development, persistence, structural transformation. The literature to date is largely focused on establishing that history matters and providing some insights into why, but I think that moving forward with new tools for accessing richer data, we can start to think about richer questions in economic development. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Melissa. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Be sure, if you have time, to stop by the CSWEP cocktail reception this evening at 6.